All right, hi everyone. So in this lecture, we are going to look at fish bones from the Nile during the Kanda period at Hierakonpolis. We are still in the pre-dynastic period, obviously. This is the second week we've been looking at it. And our focus primarily has been at looking at different objects to tell us what it can say about this particular time period. And fish bones are actually really interesting because they can tell us quite a bit. And this lecture is really based on an article that I've had you read this week. So if you haven't read it, be sure that you have. Here's a typical timeline. We are in the Naqada period still. And then here's a map I showed you before, Hierakonpolis. And if you remember from the last lecture, the Egyptians called this area Nekin. Okay, so before we look at what the bones can tell us, let's talk a little bit about weather during the pre-dynastic period. So what scholars have discovered is that the Nile area, Egypt, is getting drier. So less rain, especially in the south. And of course, if you remember one of the first weeks, we talked about the flooding of the Nile and when all that's happening, and that's based on rains in the south. So there's less rain in the south that leads to increasing dryness. And of course, what that really means is that you don't get such large flooding. And if you remember, it's the floods that really lead to land being very fertile. And when you don't get large flooding, that means that there's less land available for agriculture, meaning there's less food. It's also interesting that some of the studies are showing that there's larger variability in the winter temperatures. So what that means, and I'll talk about this in just a bit, is that sometimes you can have a very different air temperature than what the water temperature is. So usually the air is a little bit warmer, the water is cooler. It turns out that in the Nile that isn't necessarily the case. Usually what the air temperature is what the water temperature is. And that actually helps us quite a bit when we're thinking about what's going on during the weather. So what can these fish bones tell us? When I first heard about this, it was about the fish were called Nile perch. And if you've ever done any fishing, perch, at least around here, are pretty small. They were in Michigan where I grew up. Now, these perch are not. So you can see this is a 10-year-old fish. They live for quite a while. It's almost 5 feet long and weighs about 120 pounds. So these are actually fairly large fish. Now, what can they tell us? So their bones can tell us about weather patterns. And of course, the whole focus of the course is on sustainability. And what's happening in the weather definitely affects what people are doing in ancient Egypt. Now, how are these fish bones telling us what's happening? If you look at the relationship between air temperature, which I just talked a little bit about, and growth, we see that those are definitely related. So you can sort of look at this backwards by looking at these fish bones. It can tell us about possible air temperature and weather in general. And I mentioned this just before. If you've got air temperature, what does that tell us about water temperature? Well, it turns out studies have shown that air temperature is very similar to the temperature of the water in the Nile. That's usually not the case in other places, especially if you've been, say, swimming in rivers, like the American River here in California. That water is almost always colder than the air temperature, and it's primarily because it's from snowmelt. Now, you don't get that in the Nile, and the Nile is long enough that the water can equalize to the temperature of the air. So what's happening in the fish bones can definitely tell us a bit about what's happening in the weather. Now, what are we talking about here? So this is a fish vertebrae, or the backbone of the fish. And what you can see, let me see if I get the little pen here. So you can see these rings here. You can see a ring here. So it's this space in between that we're really interested in. So this space here, this space here. Now, it turns out, if you know anything about tree rings, so when you cut a tree down, you can look at the rings and it'll tell us how old the tree is. Fish vertebrae do exactly the same thing. We can look at the growth of the fish per year. So say we look at this particular area. We can compare it to, say, maybe a smaller area here. And why is this fish growing much more during this period than it is during this period? And again, it's the same as tree ring growth. So why do we care about the air temperature for one thing? So remember, we're going to jump from what the fish bones tell us in terms of those rings to trying to figure out what the weather tells us. Well, of course, it can tell us about conditions of the Nile at certain periods and what the weather is like, especially during the Nakata period. So that article talks about looking at large numbers of fish that were caught by people during the Nakata period. And when you look at these fish and then correlate the time period with, say, the pottery that's found with them, then we can then jump one step backwards and say this is what the air temperature was, or this is what the water temperature was. And that can help us figure out what's going on with agriculture. Because if you have colder air temperatures, that usually means, especially in Egypt, that you would get lower crop yield. If you have warmer temperatures, then that usually means you get a higher crop yield. Now, that's sometimes the case in Egypt because really Egypt is more dependent on the flooding of the Nile. So if you have drier periods, like I talked about during this particular period, then your agricultural output would be reduced. So the fish bones can help us look at this. Now, here's a couple of charts. So I had mentioned a few weeks ago that reading and understanding scientific charts is really important for this particular class. So what you've got here is individual growth ring width in millimeters, so like the size of the rings. And then you've got this age in years. So this is like 2 years old, 4 years old, 10 years old, 16 years old. Now this is idealized. So what it's saying is that at this point here in the chart, so bring it down to, we'll say it's 3 years. At 3 years, you get about a 3 millimeter growth ring. Let's go up from 8 years. I'm not being exactly precise here. At around 8 years, you get 2 millimeters width for the growth ring, and then so on. So as the fish gets older, the rings are reduced in terms of size. Okay, and then you get the monthly temperature corresponding to the growth. Now, Lattes is the genus of the fish, the perch. So what you're looking at here, so these are months at the bottom, and it starts with April, not January. And so this dotted line, here's the average monthly temperature of the Nile. So what this is telling us is in April, it's about 15 degrees Celsius. The peak, just here, it's about 30 degrees, which is pretty warm, and this corresponds to August. And then if you look down here, the temperature of the Nile is about 10 degrees, and that's in February. Now, if you chart this with percent growth, so here's 10% growth, this is 100%, so the largest the fish will ever get. If you look at how the fish is growing, then you will see that at about here, it's at about 100%. I can't get it totally correct. And then you see that the growth stops. So that's what cessation is, cessation of yearly growth. And if you look at this point, whoop, my line is a little crooked, but bring it down, it's really close to about this 15-degree mark. So when the water gets to be 15 degrees Celsius, then the growth in that particular year stops. So the warmer the temperature of the water, you get growth. And now it's getting cooler here, and that reaches that point, and that's when growth actually stops. So that's how we can tell what's happening in the weather with these particular rings. Now, getting back to what all of this means. If you've got lower temperatures, both water and air, that could lead to a decrease in the agricultural output. This would mean less food is around, more hunger, maybe some social breakdown, or people have to think of other things to do. Now, other studies are showing that during the same time period, people are moving closer to the river. And what this might mean is that their agricultural output might be reducing. So like wheat and barley and things like that. Then they move to the river and they can fish for their food. And that's probably where all these fish bones are coming from. So what can these bones tell us about the pre-dynastic period? Well, they can certainly tell us about the environment. In particular, we're looking at the Nakata 2 period. I haven't mentioned that, but it's not totally important. And that fluctuating or changing temperatures, that should be can lead. So fluctuating temperatures can lead to fluctuating agricultural output. So what that means is as it gets colder, you get less agricultural output. As it gets warmer until a certain point, you get more agricultural output. If it gets too hot, you get a reduction again. And then this leads to stress. Now remember, we just talked about teeth and enamel wear and stress on teeth, and that's probably correlated to the stress with agriculture. And then, of course, whenever you think about the environment and stress on inhabitants and what's going on with water temperature, think about sustainability.